that, it's an honor to welcome up some of our Defend People's Struggles campaign research team that have been working really hard to bring this information to us so we can study the situation of the attacks against our movement. We can be wise to what our enemies are trying to leverage at us and really study the situation of counter insurgency and state repression. That's the conditions that we're facing. So with that, I'll welcome up Adrian from Capybara and LPS Secretariat, Alon from Super, and Brandon from Anak Bayang Bidal.
Thank you, everyone. And we're not just representing our respective organizations up here. Oh, okay. We're also representing the local research committee that ILPS has united nationally to form in all of our local formations to really identify the specific programs that the Biden administration is creating in the local police department, in local FBI branches, and even in our communities to repress our people's movements. Right? Who? Yeah, shame. We oppose that. They're coming to crush us because our cause is just, and they really are afraid that we're going to win this. Next slide. Does anyone recognize this photo, by the way? The one before? Shout it out if you recognize it, where it's at, what the cause is. Yeah, Atlanta, Stop Cop City. And what do we know about Atlanta, Stop Cop City is that organizers there, as we'll be hearing on our panel just after this educational discussion, are literally being charged as so-called domestic terrorists as part of the repression. Yes, boo, shame. Next slide, please. And so one of our best chance, in my opinion, as an alliance, as united organizations, shout out if you chanted this chant yesterday during a mobilization or during any of our many mobilizations in this area. US imperialist is the #1 terrorist, right? Well, that's what we believe. And the Biden administration and previous US administrations have a different definition. Unfortunately, it's very similar to the one that you can look up on your phone using a search engine. I'm going to read it here. It's the quote unquote unlawful use of violence and intimidation, especially against civilians in the pursuit of political aims. So what's some of the highlight words there? Unlawful. So everything the US does, which according to its laws is legal, is okay. The 4.5 million killed by US-led wars since 9/11 is lawful. It's in the books, right? And it's many of those victims are civilians or freedom fighters. That's not terrorism, according to the US administration. The displacement of up to 60 million people, this is according to a Brown cost of war study that was released last month. That's not terrorism. That's not violence against civilians for political aim, even though we know the US system and the corporations that are really behind it are doing it for the political purpose of holding up their profits. So that's not terrorism, according to the US administration. What is being charged as terrorism are people's movements that are resisting them. Next slide, please.
So just for a little context on the campaign, so we united on launching this campaign during our National Assembly last year. You can see it in that photo right there. Yeah, raise your hand if you were at that assembly. Yeah, so you know, ILPS, we like to unite on everything. So we united on launching the campaign. This was due to the heightened repression that many activists have been facing here in the US for quite some time now, and not just in the US, but internationally. And this repression is directly correlated to programs like Biden's CDT, Countering Domestic Terrorism, which is an initiative introduced in 2021 meant to supposedly address the increased white nationalists and white supremacy and right-wing extremism as a domestic terrorist threat within the US, painting itself as like progressive. But we all know that instead of actually addressing the white nationalists and right-wing extremists, historically, programs like CDT have been used to repress the working class and people, fighting for their rights, fighting for their needs. And, as Alon was saying, the US state, only exists for the preservation of the ruling class and never to actually meet the people's needs. So our job here is to expose CDT for what it really is, which is a deliberate attack on the people and people organizing for their needs and their rights. Next slide.
And this is not the first counterinsurgency or state repression program that the US federal government, which is really the target, the central target of our Defend People's Struggle campaign, has been waging. We know the United States government, its sovereignty over this very land, here, this university with the name George Washington. Who is George Washington if not another terrorist, right? He used indiscriminate violence against Black and Indigenous people who were criminalized throughout the US history, including in its foundation when he was a general. So it really is not new. It's a very old tactic to smear and frame people's struggles, Black and Indigenous people, as well as workers, and those seeking freedom internationally who are currently in the US as so-called terrorists, to isolate leaders from their movements. And so we have on the screen just a few examples of how this is operated in the laws and practices throughout history. And in particular, the framing of people defending the rights of workers, advocating for higher wages and for better conditions, as well as fighting against the wars of conquest as foreign agents, as basically people who are not fighting for legitimate purposes, but are instead people who need to be disrupted and are violent extremists, and so on. And the most salient example of this that we are seeing building up today is really more presently with the escalation of all of these charges. So during the Trump administration, which Biden is really continuing, many of the charges against protesters in 2020 was that they are disrupting property relationships, right? They are disrupting the flow of capital to capitalists. And this is really only in a long line of history of counter domestic terrorism, of state repression, that CDT is folding all of the pre-existing patterns, practices, and governmental programs from this local police department to the surveillance state with the NSA, to the international oppression that the US military and the CIA coordinate, into one umbrella term that is CDT, and that is attempting to really reframe and rebrand, as Adrian was saying, as though the US government is so-called progressive, and as though the real targets, not the people who have always been targeted from history.
Yeah, so the research committee has been hard at work trying to break down the CDT, Biden CDT program, his initiative, to understand, they have their own language they use for what they're going to do, right? But we need to understand how this program will affect our people's movements. So yeah, we've been hard at work sort of breaking it down. So a lot of our organizations, our movements use campaigns as in organizing and fighting framework, right? We have like a campaign paper and there's sort of like these strategic goals and just general thrusts. And it's up to like individual organizations and localities to sort of particularize those generalities, right? To how they're going to operate in the area. So this is sort of similar. It's a national, pretty broad strategy that different organizations within the government, different localities will sort of particularize and sort of enact in their own way. So we're going to break it down. There's 4 pillars, and each pillar has some strategic goals that we're going to try to understand. Next slide, please. Ooh, it's really hard to see. Okay, so the first pillar is called understanding and sharing information on the full range of terror threats. So it's all about information. That is just so hard to see. So sorry. But the first strategic goal says enhance domestic terrorism related research and analysis. And if you dig into their language about how they're going to do this, what it really boils down to is that the government will secure itself against threats, people they deem terrorists, by actually calling more and more of our activists, our movements, as terrorists or terrorism operations. So they're going to be very liberal with their use of the word terrorism as a justification for oppressing us, right? The second strategic goal here is to improve information sharing across all levels within, as well as outside the federal government. So what we understand with this goal is that they're really going to continue to build and strengthen their already all-encompassing surveillance and policing apparatus. One of the things that the research team has been specifically looking at is how information and coordination happens between the feds, but also the police departments, institutions like the UW, and even private corporations, right? Because as outlined in this goal, the government works on all those levels together to coordinate repressing our people's movements. And the third goal here is illuminating the transnational aspects of domestic terrorism. So, as internationalists, people in the International League of People's Struggles, we know that the US will continue to work with repressive regimes, like in the Philippines, like the Zionist entity Israel, to suppress people's movements, both here and in those areas. Next slide, please. Yes. Ooh. Pillar 2 is called preventing, so prevention, domestic terrorism recruitment and mobilization. The first goal here, they say they're going to strengthen domestic terrorism prevention resources and services. And how they say they're specifically going to achieve that is they're going to equip and fund organizations or departments like the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, as well as policing stations. And what they want these entities to do is develop strategies for really turning their communities in those areas against the activists who are fighting for the masses, fighting for the genuine needs of those communities, right? And they're going to do this by doing stuff like that's propaganda. Yeah, they're typical. They also, here in this pillar, they recognize that a lot of our organization happens online, right? So they say they're going to address online terrorist recruitment and mobilization to violence by domestic terrorists. You might think, oh, they're gonna maybe ban people's movements, but they're also gonna ban like, the white supremacy pages too, right? But actually what we see just through history in the last couple of months and years, that really the private corporations that run, like the social media in conjunction with the state actually disproportionately target and censor people's movements, right? And not the white nationalists they say they're going after, right? So let's not believe that. Next slide, please. Pillar 3, how they're going to disrupt and deter domestic terrorism activity. They're going to enable is the key word here, appropriate enhanced investigation and prosecution of domestic terrorism crimes. And we understand that they're going to increase the budgets, the resources that go to the police, to the FBI. And not only that, oftentimes, there's supposed to be checks and balances, regulations, ways to limit, how swiftly, how severely the government can act against us to protect the people, right? We actually know that doesn't happen. Well, they're getting rid of the guys. They're going to enhance and get rid of those protections, so-called protections, to be able to very quickly and swiftly repress us. They're going to, figure out ways they can change the laws to make oppression easier against us. And they're going to ensure that the screening and vetting processes consider the full range of terrorism threats. So right now, employment, immigration includes screenings that look at, do you have the warning signs of a terrorist? Are you a terrorist, right? these screenings are going to be beefed up. So, employment and immigration are going to increasingly, they already are, but increasingly become spaces or become avenues through which the government can do repression. Okay. And then the pillar 4 has a long-term view. Pillar 4 is how they're going to confront the long-term contributors to domestic terrorism. So if you read through this pillar, they say they're going to fight racism and bigotry, as they understand that racism and bigotry often the white nationalists are racist and bigots. But they're going to do that by, in their words, eliminating bias. So if anyone's ever taken like a anti-bias, no racism workshop, y'all know how well that works. And I mean, yeah, they're not doing anything threatening the actual racism. And overall, they're going to want to enhance the faith in the government, right? Our faith in them, and our commitment to so-called American democracy. And how they're going to do that is through kind of band-aid economic welfare and also civil education, i.e. propaganda, right? So all that to say, the US government will do nothing to address the fundamental social and political economic relations that really, that lead to the worsening social and political crisis, that actually pushes people to join people's movements, to fight, to struggle against the system, right? They're going to do nothing to actually address those conditions and those relations, which, lead to the people's movements that they're going to label as terrorist. Next slide.
And as a local research committee, we're trying to uncover each of these pillars and their manifestations locally in our institution. So this is just a few examples of what we've been able to investigate so far as we begin the process of building up to shutting down the CDT program and all forms of state repression that our movements are facing. So on the your left here is actually one of the drones that Seattle Police Department has acquired through a Department of Homeland Security grant. $6 million a year Department of Homeland Security is currently giving to the Seattle Police Department. And we were able to uncover that quite a bit of it, 2.3 million, was specifically to acquire drones. Maybe in some of our upcoming protests or past protests and mobilizations, you'll be seeing these drones flying above you, trying to capture your faces and identification, trying to spot movement leaders. That is a direct consequence of Biden's CDT program, as well as past state repression programs that are having a local ramification. As well, here on the right is our local federal building FBI representative for our region. The FBI is increasingly integrated in the prisons, in the Seattle Police Department. Even when I'm going on the light rail, I'm seeing a Seattle Police Department, Joint Department of Homeland Security and FBI, so-called anti-terrorism squad, doing contact policing, saying hi to passengers, as though they're there to be buddy-buddy with everyone, and not a force of repression against all of us. And so these are just a few of the examples that we've begun to uncover, but there are so many more potential targets. There are so many more local manifestations. And that is why really at this stage in our campaign, we need all of your support to really investigate and find out and then unite, target, and shut down all of these examples. We know from past campaigns that ILPS member organizations are currently carrying out throughout the country, particularly against programs like the Countering Violent Extremism, that these programs don't just go to the repressive agencies themselves, which is where primarily the research committee's current research has gone, but it's really going into our communities. We know that post 9/11, for instance, Muslim communities were particularly targeted. They went into mosques to do so-called faith-based countering violent extremism, where they would have informants and using that, particularly to the court and to charge leaders of faith-based communities who want to push their communities towards fighting and defending their rights during an incredibly repressive time for Muslim Americans and all oppressed people after 9/11. So we want to highlight that there is still a lot of work to be done locally, and that is also our part of our call, is we want to hear from you and to build together our database, our counter surveillance of CDT so that we can shut down.
So now we're going to talk about a couple of examples of how CDT is already kind of being used against activists in the country. Obviously, Alon mentioned the example of Cop City with the photo in the left. Yeah, there's been protesters being hit with domestic terrorism charges in Atlanta just for organizing a bail fund. And this is a direct consequence of CDT being talked about locally all around the US. They've been increasing their communication with local police departments. So it's no surprise that protesters are now being hit with these sorts of charges. But does anyone know what the photo on the right is from? That's right. Yep, the Tampa 5. So the Tampa 5, if you guys aren't aware, they were SDS protesters, which SDS is a member organization of ILPS. They were basically accosted and jostled by the police just for protesting on campus. I mean, how many of us have been, have protested on campus before? Raise your hand. Exactly. This could have literally happened to any one of us. It could have happened to us yesterday when we were protesting. I mean, all they were doing was protesting on campus, and they were hit with trumped up charges of police battery and assault. And when in reality they were just keeping to themselves and trying to continue the protest. So this is something that is really alarming and is even happening within our sphere of, I guess, our organizing sphere within ILPS. And we should really be concerned with it because, like I said, it could really happen to any of us. I mean, we've all protested on campus before. We've all protested in public spaces. So it really sets a precedent that we really want to push back against. But yeah, can we go next? To go over some objectives of the campaign, there's a full list of objectives on the campaign paper, but these are some highlights. First, we want to unite ILPS US members in joint action and make it a fighting league. Urge the building of organizations. Being organized is our best defense. Sharpen awareness and analysis on history and current impacts of US counterinsurgency programs. And erode support for these programs and shut them down. That's kind of, I want to really highlight that point. That's like the main thing. We really want to shut down CDT, and we want to prevent the implementation of similar programs in the future. We want to show the US and the ruling class that you can't stop the people from organizing. You can't stop them from advocating for their rights and for their needs. And we also want to support the existing defense campaigns of LPS members. We have, a lot of LPS members who are currently facing state repression, like we talked about with the Tampa Bay 5. We have, recently organizers with Bayan who were arrested in the East Coast. So we really want to, support these existing defense campaigns as part of our larger Defend People Struggle campaign. Next slide. So we have a couple of calls to action. First, if you're not organized already, please join an organization. And if you are currently part of an organization, please urge them to join ILPS. You just have to agree to one of the concerns. You can find one of us to set up an orientation. Pretty much anyone wearing this shirt, honestly, you probably ask. And then uncover and expose the state repression, join our research team. Like Alon was saying, if we had more people, even recently, like they released an updated document on the CDT about talking about all the achievements and successes that they had the past 2 years of its existence. And, something we could be doing and we should be working on is like a response to that statement that they recently released. And if we had, more people, it would be a lot easier to, release that statement, as soon as it was released, which was like 4 days ago or something. So yeah, please scan this QR code if you want to help us and join our research team and really expose more of the local manifestations of CDT here in the Seattle-Tacoma area. And yeah, just continue developing the Defend People Struggle campaign as LPS US. Next slide. Oh, that's it. So yeah.